Beg pardon? Yes. Our panelists this afternoon include Professor Linda Wagner of the English Department at Michigan State University, Professor Arthur Shoemaker of DePaul University at Greencastle, Indiana, Professor Clarence Andrews, Michigan Technological University at Houghton, and Professor William Miller of Ball State University, Muncie, Indiana. And our first speaker will be Professor Wagner. Professor Wagner has just finished a book on Hemingway and Faulkner, and she's had two books on William Carlos Williams and another on Denise Levertov. And she has just finished editing, I believe, 4 decades of Faulkner criticism to be published soon by Michigan State University Press. And her subject is on Midwestern poets. I might say, of course, that our topic this afternoon is the significance of writers who remained Midwesterners. And so we seem to have a precise definition, or at least a delimitation, upon the subject, and look forward to hearing these addresses. Ms. Wagner.
I have to change that title just a bit and from past tense, writers who remained Midwesterners, because thankfully many of the poets I'm going to just briefly mention are alive and still writing. So we have to say writers who remain Midwesterners too, in that sense. It seems rather strange to me. I guess I took poetry because I thought everybody else would be doing fiction, and I'm afraid that's what's happened to everybody on these panels. So inasmuch as I've just left Hemingway in this great state of typed pages, you know, if I can work him in here, I will. But I think in both poetry and fiction, the importance of the Midwestern writer was and is in this century not so much his thematic emphasis as his great need, really, to innovate. And I think most of the innovation in 20th century writing has sprung from Midwestern writers. Writers who may not have lived in the Midwest, but certainly, as at some point in their writing, they've indicated that their spirit is very much still with their Midwestern point of origin. And in poetry, it kind of works this way, that among the people from this century that we consider the great poets, Marianne Moore, Archibald MacLeish, Hart Crane, these are all Midwestern poets. Imagine if Hart Crane had used Garrettsville, Ohio instead of New York in the bridge, we'd have had another Patterson kind of thing going, you see. And it was probably just his point of theory that led him out of this direction. He wasn't quite in the same critical bin as William Carlos Williams, for example. Edgar Lee Masters, T.S. Eliot, and Ezra Pound. I'm going to dare to include those people, even though I realize that we still fall into this critical cliche of saying, yes, but they left this country, and in some sense you get, with the Midwestern writer, I think, a terrific sense of his own independence, his own right to make up his own mind. I'll point out that there are very few established critics as such that are from the Midwest. And it seems to me that the Midwestern temperament is almost more primary, almost more creative, almost more rule-breaking kind of origin than it is one who follows philosophical patterns, who does what he's been told to do, and so on. I think this is a strength, but it's also led to a terrific critical lag, because many of our established critics never knew what our Midwestern writers were doing as such, because they didn't fit into neat bins. So I think T.S. Eliot's own decision about his own allegiances and so on is in some ways a very Midwestern temperament kind of trait. And Ezra Pound, the people who knew Pound, who know him still, will tell you that Pound was never anything but an American writer. And through the cantos, this, of course, is is randomly suggested, but very strongly suggested, that you really get a sense of Pound's Haley, Idaho, and then Pennsylvania kind of location. But I'm afraid, much as we tend to do with writers, we say, well, they've gone this direction, or because they have left. People's personal circumstances sometimes get beyond what they can handle, and so they leave for other reasons besides just alienation with their location. When I think of Ezra Pound and his directives in all of his prose writing, for example, ABC of Reading, that wonderful short paragraph when he says, teaching poets how to write poetry. If you want to learn how to make an automobile, do you go to a man who has made an automobile and driven it, or do you go to a man who has only heard about it? And that kind of approach to aesthetics seems to me particularly, even without the car analogy, particularly Midwestern. Go to the source, this kind of thing. The importance of Sandberg and Vachel Lindsay, it seems to me, is not a thematic importance so much as it is one that I don't believe we critics have caught up with yet, but a lot of the contemporary poets have, and this is their emphasis on the sounds of a poem, the natural rhythms of a poem, in other than a snobbishly elite kind of prosody. If you ever hear Sandberg reading his own poems, you know that man had a rhythmic identity for those poems, which is not always apparent from just reading them on the page. And I think our songwriters, I think our young people, are really much closer to the direction that Lindsay and Sandberg were going than maybe a lot of our serious published poets and so on. I mean, I think this is a whole new direction. And if we tend to classify Sandberg and Lindsay as thematic poets entirely, we miss, a lot of the importance that they've had for practical prosody today. The same spirit of independent egoism, which seems to be evident in both the fiction writers and the poets of the early years, and may have been a key trait in their survival as writers of this period, carried on maybe was intensified in the next generation of poets, the ones we refer to today as the middle generation. And among those we have Kenneth Rexroth. We may think of him as connected with San Francisco and with the Renaissance there, but of course he is from South Bend, Indiana. He spent quite a bit of time in Toledo, and as well as Chicago. And this point of origin for Rexroth himself is very important. Rexroth single-handedly bringing in Oriental literature, bringing in the classics, bringing in the art of translation. The man's impact on contemporary letters is certainly going to be great once it is fully recognized. Another Ohio figure is Kenneth Patchen from Niles, Ohio, and his location, first in the East and then in the West, is again more a matter of his own personal history, his terrible ailment, his back ailment, which once he got someplace, it was very hard for him to leave. He was certainly not a mobile person. And yet, there is a poem of his on the handout. It's an Akron poem, again. And his influence in contemporary prose, as well as poetry, is one that is, so far as I know, critically unrecognized, but very real. And these are the writers of the future. We just have to get the public relations people started, get some Midwestern critics to pick up these people. John Berryman, Kenneth Fearing, Weldon Keys, Richard Eberhart. These are all men that we can claim as Midwestern writers. And of course, Theodore Roethke, our own Saginaw poet, whose career at this institution was unfortunately short-lived, but went ahead at University of Washington to create so much influence, such circles of influence, that it was said a few years ago that Roethke's influence west of the Mississippi was as great as William Carlos Williams' influence east of the Mississippi. And this is such a strange shifting of geographic pattern when Roethke started out here, and we should never have lost him. We didn't. We can tell this from the poems that he wrote. But the influence patterns are a little different. By adoption, Carl Shapiro, I suppose, most people would consider as Midwestern, although, of course, he was not born He was born in Maryland, but his influence as editor of poetry and his time in Nebraska, I think, made him a representative of that group of poets, not so rich in influence on the contemporary writers as Patchen and Berriman and Rexroth, but certainly important. The place of the Midwestern magazine, now that I've mentioned poetry, I'm not going way back, but poetry itself, coming out of Chicago and out of Amy Lowell and her interests there, Harriet Monroe, is now, 52 years old. And along with that, the little review, which at least began in the Midwest, Robert Bly's, the 50s, the 60s, and now the 70s, has been a terribly important source for other writers in terms of whether they're giving the Blue Toad Award to someone that they have become disenamored of, or discovering poems like Galway Connell's The Bear or whatever. I mean, this has really been a vital source among contemporary poets. The Prairie Schooner, Beloit Poetry Journal, Kenyon Review, of course, and most recently our little Michigan Sumac, which was one of the finest quarterlies and now has gone into book publishing only, and the quarterly is kind of diminished, but very important sources for their time. So that among contemporary poets we have James Wright, who last year won the Pulitzer Prize for his collected poems and has made Martins Ferry, Ohio, probably more famous than Howells did in his day because of his different approach. You know, the fact that you use the concrete, you use the local, and therefore you use place names as an integral way to the reader, and so on. Robert Bly, with his theory of the deep image, which has changed the direction of much contemporary poetry from the static image, the kind of direct focus that we have left from imagism, into the poem as a more surreal instrument now, a way of a voyage of discovery into yourself and so on. I think Bly and his journal were largely responsible for this comparatively new emphasis, or a pickup of an older emphasis. William Stafford, John Logan, Gwendolyn Brooks, George Starbuck, Jim Harrison, Robert Hayden, Phil Levine. Hayden and Levine are both Detroit poets. You've probably noticed the kind of strange omission of Detroit. I mean, all we hear today is Chicago, but Detroit is surfacing, and Ron mentioned Don Lee, and you have Neoma Madgett, you have Dudley Randall, and you have Phil Levine, and you know, Detroit is being heard from. We don't really have to even borrow Joyce Carol Oates, who's from upstate New York, unfortunately, to say that, you know, Detroit is making it today. And Fred Ekman, John Woods at Western Michigan, probably one of the finest contemporary American poets, consistently. Very good. One might be tempted to say that the Midwestern poet, in a way, has come of age in these last 15 or 20 years, that instead of trying to hide his point of origin, that he has, in a good sense, begun exploiting it. Because you will find, because of this emphasis on writing from your own experience, writing from your own local, as Williams used to phrase it, instead of locale, that you have a need to bring in place names. And I think some of this is evident if you just glance through the poems on the handout that I've given you. When John Wood says, the deep wells are drying in Martinsville, Indiana, you know, you need to be particular. Through this, you get to the universal. But this is our whole 20th century aesthetic. And it has to have the same kind of operation in poetry that it had in Winesburg, Ohio, or Main Street, or whatever. You have to make these things definite so that people can at least recognize this much and then go from there. The maligned reputation of the Midwest as a poor milieu for art may be up for question. As I said, we've been at the mercy of critics who are not Midwesterners very often. And it may be that they were reading even the novels of Sinclair Lewis in a way that led them to think that he meant one thing, when perhaps if you take his work as a whole, this was not the opinion he was trying to give. We may have been being read out of context, trying to make things work that really weren't operative. But even if the milieu did act as an irritant, the whole reach of 20th century literature, I think, especially in poetry, should prove that if it was an irritant, it was an irritant that was at least inciting people to create, and they were creating works whose reputation is not even questionable any longer, because these people are firmly established as the fiction writers. And I don't think we need to feel any need to apologize for the Midwestern poet. Thank you.
Our second speaker in this afternoon's panel will be Professor Clarence Andrews of Michigan Technological University at Houghton. Professor Andrews has published writing and just finished that in February of this year. He published by Glencoe Press. He has a new book appearing soon on a history of Iowa literature. In addition, he's written introductions to Editions of the Jungle, Sister Carrie, and so on. And this afternoon, his talk will be on four Iowa writers whom he has known personally. So I'll turn the panel over to Mr. Andrews.
I have some bibliographies here rather than try to hand them around. Well, we can do that.
I can help you. I assume this counts for the third handout that I was talking about.
That may be right. In the 1830s, the westward move of humanity began across the prairies. By 1890, as Professor Alan Bogue tells us, the prairies had been converted into the farm belt. By 1890, the westward move of people began to reverse itself. Of course, it reversed itself much earlier. Carolyn Kirkland had come to Michigan in the 1830s and then had gone back to the east already. But by 1890, we have Hamlin Garland, for instance, going to Chicago, to Boston, and eventually turning westward again to California, where he died. In 1900, we have Carl Van Vechten reversing the trend. His parents had come from Wisconsin to Iowa. Carl Van Vechten graduated from college in Cedar Rapids, went on to Chicago, on to New York, on to Paris, back to New York, where he died. His ashes were scattered in the Shakespeare Garden in New York City. In 1910 or thereabouts, we have Floyd Dell, Susan Glassbell, George Graham Cook, Harry Hansen, leaving the Queen City of the Mississippi, Davenport, Iowa, and going on to Chicago, to Provincetown, to Greenwich Village, and ultimately for Floyd Graham Cook, for George Graham Cook, Parnassos in Egypt, or in Greece, where he died and was buried, a saint among the local peasants. And I could go on with this kind of thing. For instance, of Iowa's living writers, and I'm talking about Iowa writers today, I'm a native Iowan. I am definitely misplaced in northern Michigan. It's an alien world. Of Iowa writers who are living today, McKinley Cantor lives in Sarasota, Florida. Richard Bissell lives in Essex, Connecticut. Hartzell Spence lives over there in Connecticut somewhere, having moved there from a place in Virginia. Thomas Duncan lives out in Apple Valley, California. Ferner Noon, Ruth Suko's husband, a writer in his own right, though, lives in that town in California, has all the colleges, Scripps colleges. And Paul Corey lives out there on the West Coast. But 4 Iowa writers remain in the state, or near the state where they were born. These 4 people are James Hurst, whose grandfather established a farm near Cedar Falls, Iowa, and James has never been very far from that farm. A childhood accident crippled him and has practically confined him to his hometown. His brother still runs the farm. This farm, his brother Charles Hurst was one of those responsible for the visit of Khrushchev to America a few years back. The second man is Paul Engel, who was born near Cedar Rapids, Iowa, very close to it, and who has spent, aside from his tour as a Rhodes Scholar in England, and aside from some around-the-world trips which he's made, has spent practically all of his life in Iowa City, Iowa, 25 miles from where he was born. The third man is John Towner Frederick, who was born in southwest Iowa in Corning, on land that had been farmed by his grandparents. And today, John Towner Frederick, who retired not too long ago as chairman of the English department at Notre Dame, lives on a farm just outside of Iowa City, Iowa, which has been in his wife's family since the government grants. The fourth man is Frederick Manfred, who some of you may know by another name, Fikey Fikema. And Frederick Manfred lives in Blue Mound near Laverne, Minnesota, which is not more than about 50 miles from where he was born in Dune, Iowa. These four people, although they have sometimes left the Middle West, have stayed there. And incidentally, all of these men are now near the end of their career. So we can look back at them as four people who stayed in the Middle West, and we can ask, what were their accomplishments? Let me take James Hurst first, and Tom, would you give us a sample? This is James Hurst reading one of his own poems.
Clover swabs. My eyes are cloudy with death. I saw 30 acres of clover fall over the sickle bar today. Not the grim reaper, but a bright steel sickle out of I-8C, guaranteed for 60 days against faulty or defective workmanship. 30 acres of clover in full bloom died today, besides such incidentals as a hen pheasant with both legs cut off, her eggs decorating horses' hooves, and only God can count the number of bobolinks and meadowlarks that find their will leveled. 30 acres of clover just in its prime, in its greatest flower this field, lusty, sweet-smelling, the seed nose filling. Tonight when I go for the cows, I shall see it lying there in flat, definite swabs. Only the young men go to war.
Thank you, Tom. Jim Hurst is now close to 70. His lifetime accomplishment is 5 volumes of verse, and you have it there in that bibliography, which I handed around to you. That seems like, in his own words, a rather limited view. But James Hurst is a very careful and precise worker who thinks not once, not twice, but many times about every word and every line of his verse. Jim once wrote to my daughter and said, Terry, I was born under the sign of the threshing machine. And all of his verse has been written under the sign of the threshing machine. Professor Renninger, a longtime friend of his, chairman of the English department at the University of Northern Iowa, where Jim has taught as a visiting professor, since he doesn't have the formal academic background that some colleges require, said he places Jim Hurst in the tradition of Robert Frost. Jim tries to get into his poems that depth of meaning that we find in Frost poems. He doesn't quite succeed. I don't know why, and I won't speculate about it. If you want to read his poetry, you can speculate about it. The second man I want to talk about is Frederick Manfred, who was born at Dune, and who in the early 30s, about 40 years ago, came to, it's Calvin College, I believe, in, is that right, in Michigan, where he was one of 3 or 4 distinguished Dutch descendants who were writing. De Vries there, and de Jong, 2 de Vries, right? And de Jong and Frederick Manfred. His first books, you have them here on the bibliography, were a volume of 3 in which they're Romana class. People in Northwest Iowa, people at Calvin College, people elsewhere can find themselves in these books. They are records of a man's attempts to come to terms with the academy, with industry in the East, and finally with science in Minneapolis, Minnesota. From this, Manfred turned to a novel about the Dust Bowl of South Dakota. The Golden Bowl, I think, is the title of it. And from this, he turned to what I think is one of the best farm novels, and Roy Meyer at Mankato agrees on this, and that is This Is the Year, the novel of Pierre Frickson. Here, Manfred turned to the Frisian background of northwest Iowa and attempted to establish a mythical relationship between the Pierre of 1920, 1930, 1940, and the Dutch settlers and the Frisian settlers who had come into northwest Iowa. Some of them settled in Dune, a town named by Englishmen. I lived in northwest Iowa for a while, and we had a vulgar mythology about what happened, why the Englishmen were pushed out of Dune and the Dutchmen settled. I'll leave that to your imaginations. The real achievement of Frederick Manfred is that in northwest Iowa, southwest Minnesota, southeast South Dakota, and northeast Nebraska, he built a literary empire, which he called Siouxland. Having written about Maury in The Golden Bowl and about Pierre Frickson in This Is the Year, Manfred said he began to wonder about the backgrounds of these men. What influences were there in the air that might have made these men the way they were? And so he began to look into the past. And this investigation took him back to two very fine Indian novels, Conquering Horse, what's the other one? There's another name, I'm sorry. Conquering Horse is one. One of these is about the Sioux Indian before the advent of the white man. And although many people have commented upon the difficulty, John Frederick and Paul Engel, among others, that a white man would have in relating the life of the Sioux Indians before the white man came, I think Manfred, in Conquering Horse, a story of the initiation rites of a young Indian boy, has succeeded. Certainly Manfred has sympathy and compassion for the Sioux, who were, of course, in that area before the white man came. His second novel about the Indian and the white man is set at the time of the Sioux Indian uprisings in southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, around 1855 to 1865, the Spirit Lake Massacre in northwest Iowa, and the New Ulm Massacre in southwest Minnesota. Here, Manfred's hero is a heroine, a woman, who falls in love with one of her Indian captors, a man who has helped destroy the community in which she lived. And at the end, her sympathies are with the Indian. She rejects, after her Indian lover has been put to death by a man for whom a county in Iowa later was named, she rejects her white heritage and goes back to live with the Indians, because for her it is a better world than the white world. In Lord Grizzly, a subject which John Neihardt has also used, and some other people besides, Manfred created what I think is his best novel, a novel about a man who was clawed by a grizzly and left to die by some of his comrades, and who crawled 200 miles on his belly. That's a Middle Western form of speech. No Middle Westerner I knew when I was growing up would ever say on his stomach. He crawled 200 miles on his belly, seeking revenge. This is a real accomplishment to make a novel out of a man crawling 200 miles that way. But Manfred succeeds. Lord Grizzly is a fine novel. So that is Manfred's accomplishment, to have established a literary empire. He was, of course, influenced by Faulkner. Faulkner is one of his heroes. The sad part about it is that Manfred is left out of his literary history most of the 19th century. He's either before the pioneer movement into the country, or he starts in about 1920, but he hasn't covered that period in between. Incidentally, he has told me he has another novel, Mink Wolves, but I've not been able to find any reference to it, and I checked yesterday again to make sure. Which brings me to Paul Engel and John Towner Frederick, whose accomplishment, I think, is something else. John Towner Frederick came to Iowa City as an undergraduate student, and there met Edwin Ford Piper, a man born in Nebraska who had moved to Iowa. In his own right, Piper is a very fine poet. His Barbed Wire and Other Poems, published in 1917 and again in 1924, is a fine set of poems about Nebraska and the pioneer experience. In 1915, while still an undergraduate student, John Towner Frederick and some friends, discouraged because Middle Western writers, and particularly young Middle Western writers, could find no market unless they wrote of the Midwestern character in the terms that Eastern editors decreed. If they created a kind of a hick, overall-wearing farmer, then the Eastern writers would accept what they wrote. But if they wrote honestly about the farm experience, the Eastern writers, and they controlled the publishing of the Times, would not publish what they wrote. So John Towner Frederick founded this magazine, The Midland, in Iowa City, Iowa. It existed until 1933. And in those 17 years, the names that flow through this magazine, the names of young writers who are writing for the first time, is history. Ruth Succo is here for the first time with 4 lines of verse, and secondly with her best short story, Uprooted. Phil Stong is here. Jim Hurst is here for the first time. And on and on. I didn't bother to bring the list with me of writers that John Towner Frederick published for the first time and encouraged to write. He introduced, he himself knew the Knopfs in New York. The Knopfs published both of John Towner Frederick's novels, Druida and Greenbush, which incidentally is set in Michigan, over here at Glenny on the lake northeast of here. He introduced Ruth Succo to H.L. Mencken and Georgine Nathan, both of whom knew Frederick both very well and who had a great deal of respect for Frederick's critical and editorial abilities. And Smart Set and later American Mercury began publishing Succo's things. Frederick never paid a nickel for anything that appeared in the 17 years this magazine was published. Most of the time, he financed it out of his own pocket. But in its first year of publication, the brand new, that's a Midwestern expression, the brand new O'Brien Best Short Stories of the Year published 2 stories out of this slender volume, and it is slender. It never got very much bigger than this. Most of the time, as I say, John Towner Frederick financed this out of his own pocket. This love affair between O'Brien and Frederick went on. Year after year, O'Brien praised this publication and said, year after year, the best writing being done in America by young writers today is being published by Midland. Along about 1930, O'Brien proposed that Frederick and a couple of other literary publications pool their sources and make the Middle West the literary capital of the United States. In 1925, H.L. Mencken said that the Middle West had become the literary capital of the United States. Now, this publication, going on in the Middle West, encouraging young writers, led to something much more important. And that was the notion that American literature ought to be taught in American universities. As late as 1940, I find a writer, I think it's Howard Mumford Jones, complaining because American universities are still ignoring American literature. But more than that, at the University of Iowa, it became acceptable to write short stories and fiction, longer length novels, and poetry, and plays, and submit them in class for credit. And ultimately, under Paul Engel, to award MA, MFA, and PhD degrees on the basis of a novel, a collection of short stories, a play, a volume of poetry. Wallace Stegner's White Mud, Wallace Stegner from Lake Mills, Iowa, was one, I think it's the first creative dissertation in America in Iowa City. Out of that came the Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa, which still exists today, and Paul Engel has gone on now to create a new one, an International Writers' Workshop. I've been talking about Paul. Paul grew up Cedar Rapids. He was encouraged there by wealthy dilettantes, if I may use that word for these people, of Cedar Rapids, the same people who encouraged Grant Wood. And in case any of you don't know who Grant Wood is, there's one of his paintings. An American regionalist, a man who wrote a book called Revolt Against the Cities. These same people encouraged Paul Engel and Grant Wood. Paul went to Coe. His senior honors thesis was published by Yale University as one of its Yale Younger Poets series. He went on, he won a Rhodes Scholarship and went to Oxford, where he became acquainted with Edmund Blunden. The friendship has gone on a lifelong basis. But Engel came back from Oxford. While in Europe, he wrote poems critical of what he saw happening in America in the early years of the Depression. He also wrote a poem which won the Century of Progress Prize at the Chicago Century of Progress, and which, incidentally, got him a lot of criticism. You have Paul's bibliography here. It's substantial. But Paul, and sorry I have to report this, isn't a great poet. He's a substantial poet. That's a substantial volume, a number of verses there, and some of them are good, and some of them, according to critics, I'll put it in their words, are not so good. And I'll tell you why I think that Paul has not been the great poet that he might have become. It's because since around 1937, Paul Engel has contributed more of his energy to helping other people than he has to helping himself. Paul, starting in 1935, this magazine had been dead for 2 years, founded this magazine at the University of Iowa, American Prefaces. Prefaces in the lives of young American writers. And this publication went on until it was put out of existence by the war, paper shortages and all that sort of thing. And again, if we look at now here's the 5th anniversary issue. Here are some of the writers who have published in this thing in 5 years. T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, these are not all young American writers. Invariably, this sort of publication starts out to help young writers and invariably ends up publishing Theodore Roethke. O.E. Rollvag, Grant Wood, Stephen Benet, Muriel Rukeyser, Louis Adamick, Paul Engel, and others. Well, it published people like Marion Louise Bliss, and it published people like John Noble Camel, and Eleanor Saltzman, and people like that, as well as these better-known names. Almost single-handedly, Engel is responsible for the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Between them, 3 Iowa people, one of whom I haven't mentioned, Arthur Davison Fickey, who was a classmate at Harvard of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Whitter Binner. Arthur Davison Fickey, Paul Engel, and John Towner Frederick have known every major writer of consequence in England and the United States in the last 40 or 50 years, and among them have been responsible for the appearance of practically every one of these men on the campus of the University of Iowa. Now, I'm not stressing Iowa here. This is the Middle West. This provincial Middle West. You know, the people in New York, and I have friends there, they say, where are you from? And I say, Iowa. And they say, oh, yeah, you've got a football team. What's that guy's name that coaches it? And you grow potatoes. That's what they think of the hinterlands beyond the Hudson. But the contributions, particularly of John Towner Frederick and Paul Engel, have been such that Iowa did, and the Middle West did, Chicago, become the literary capital of the United States in many ways. Now, let me close here by giving you just Paul Engel's voice, talking about a poem he wrote upon the death of
All through that day, I wrote this.
Can you hear this as well enough?
I listened, not very gracefully, I must admit. Seem an artist to be extraordinarily stupid in making remarks about art. And I made a few speeches of my own, and I'm sure that their reaction was, my God, even Forrest.
That's Paul Engle talking about writing a poem about the black man, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? And the poem was occasioned by his seeing on the cover of Life the photograph of Mrs. King as she sat in the church on the occasion of the memorial services or the funeral services for her husband. Well, there are 4 Iowans. I've known all of them. I know all of them because they're all still alive, who have, I think, made a considerable accomplishment. Yet you won't find the names of any one of these 4 people in Spiller and Tharp, not to the best of my knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andrews. Our next speaker is Professor Arthur Shoemaker, DePaul University, Greencastle, Indiana. Professor Shoemaker is well qualified to talk on Indiana writers who remained Midwesterners because he has written a history of Indiana literature which was published in 1962 by the Indiana Historical Society. Professor Shoemaker.
This topic of Midwestern literature is very interesting to me because I have worked on it. I have taught, of course, a number of Midwestern writers. My own area of particular interest is, as the chairman said, Indiana literature. I have been interested in Indiana literature in a number of ways. I have written on it in various ways, taken part in the Indiana literary map. And I suppose you probably know there are literary maps of various states, some of them good, perhaps some leave something to be desired. But I've been quite interested in this whole field. Now what I would like to do is first to tell you a few facts concerning Indiana literature. I'll draw some of this material from my own writing. And then if there is time, I will tell you some of the interesting facts about individual writers. You know, some years ago, Ken Hubbard, who was famous for the Abe Martin series, everybody in Indiana is either an author or a politician. He said, now, of course, there are a few tradespeople, but only enough to take care of the needs of the authors and the politicians. Of course, this is an absurd exaggeration, yet with all these stories, and there are many of them, there still is a modicum of truth, because Indiana has had so much in the way of writing. When I started writing on this, I knew nothing about Indiana literature, except that I knew that there was such a person as James Whitcomb Riley, and he wrote mostly poems which children recited under duress on Friday afternoon in schools. And there was Booth Tarkington, who wrote Penrod and Sam, and a few things like that. To my great surprise, however, when I finished all my sources of information, I found I had cataloged 1,563 Indiana writers. Now, to be sure, this is a tremendous amount of dead wood. Most of it is dead wood. A lot of it was vanity publishing, or the kind of thing that a person publishes when he has retired, and he is now writing a few verses for his grandchildren, or telling about some of the experiences that he had as a boy when the country was just being opened up back in the early days and so on. But at the same time, there remained that tremendous quantity, and I had to go through all these. Well, I finally, of course, got rid of most of them until I had about 150 that I wrote on. I found, as one of the tangential elements of my study that there have been many juvenile writers, that is, writers of juvenile materials. I cataloged at least 124, and I stopped that about 20 years ago, and there have been many people since then. As a matter of fact, some people who have been perhaps a little more patriotic, as far as Indiana is concerned, than accurate, have said this, that Indiana writers have dominated the field of juveniles. This is, of course, a matter of discussion, but there still are many juvenile writers. Now, in 1934, Edward Weeks, in behalf of the Columbia University Institute of Arts and Sciences, compiled a list of American books which have had the largest sales since 1875. 5 of the 20 titles listed were from the pens of Indiana writers, 3 of the 5 being novels of Gene Stratton Porter. Indeed, Indiana authors have long made the lists of bestsellers with such titles, and let's see if you recognize very many of these. Edward Eggleston's A Hoosier Schoolmaster, 1871. Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur, certainly everybody has been exposed one way or another, at least in the movies, to that, 1880. Riley's The Old Swimmin' Hole, and 11 more poems, not 11, 11 more poems, 1883. Charles Major's When Knighthood Was in Flower, 1899. George Bar McCutcheon's Graustark, 1901. And this spawned a whole series of Graustark novels. You know, this was about a tiny mythical Balkan kingdom which is populated by beautiful women and undersized, very dangerous men. And it is required, since these people were continually getting Europe in all sorts of diplomatic troubles, it required a red-blooded American to go over there and set things right, and incidentally marry the princess. This started a whole era in fiction, of minor consequence to be sure, but still very popular. Gene Stratton Porter's Freckles, 1904, A Girl of the Limberlost, 1909, The Harvester in 1911. I wonder how many of you have read any of these Gene Stratton Porter novels. They're not.
Wash away a kiss.
Can you what?
Can you wash away a kiss?
Oh.
I read it.
Thank you for being. If I understand your epithet per se. Going on with this. Laddie, 1913. Michael O'Halloran, 1915. Booth Tarkington's Penrod, 1914. Ernie Pyle's Here Is Your War, 1943. I'm skipping quite a few years here. Brave Men, 1944. Last Chapter, 1946. Ross F. Lockridge Jr.'s Raintree County, 1948. Elmer Davis's But We Were Born Free, 1954. In fact, the New Encyclopedia of American History lists approximately 136 books, which were the most widely read in the 90-year period, 1861 to 1951. And 19 of them, or about 15%, were by Hoosier authors. The popularity of Indiana authors is also evident in the large number of their novels and stories that have been converted into the form of motion pictures. The sales of such popular writers as George Bar McCutcheon, who wrote the Graustark series, Gene Stratton Porter, reached into the millions of copies. The trenches of World War I were littered with copies of Freckles, as you may have heard. The reason being that soldiers wanted to try to recapture that simplicity and nostalgia that they had left behind. Many men made fortunes, like Riley and Tarkington. Some people from one book alone, like Lew Wallace from Ben-Hur, Morris Thompson from Alice of Old Vincennes, George Ade from Fables in Slang. Now, one of the best of all analyses of the production of Hoosier bestsellers was made in 1947 by the new librarian at that time, John H. Moriarty of Purdue University, who wondered if the reputation of Hoosier letters was well deserved. After a study of data, he reported that in the preceding 50 years, books of Indiana authors sold better than the works of the writers of any other state save New York. Now get a load of that. And the Hoosier record nearly equaled that of the Empire State. Now, I will not go through all the machinations by which he made up a very complex point system, but he did this, and he came out with points as follows. The top 10 were New York with a score of 218. Take a deep breath. Indiana with a score of 213. The next one is Pennsylvania with 125, Virginia 102, Kentucky 94, Missouri 80, Ohio 73, Michigan 70, Minnesota 67, California 64. This is rather an amazing result in view of the fact that New York's population, and therefore the potential authors of bestsellers, averaged almost 4 times that of Indiana during the 40-year period analyzed. Now, we have discovered thus far in this conference, and I think I made this statement this morning, we're having a difficult time in trying to identify a Midwestern author. What is a Midwestern author? Similarly, what then is a Hoosier author or an Ohio author, or Iowa, whatever it is? I tended to use this definition. I said, number one, a person born in Indiana who spent all or most of his life in the state, as you would expect. Person who spent all or most of his life in the state, not born in Indiana. Number three, a writer not born in Indiana who spent a few years here which were very productive in his literary career. And in the fourth place, a person whose Indiana background influenced strongly his later writing. Now, what I tried to do then in general was simply say, a person, in order to be a Hoosier author, as far as I'm concerned, had to be identified one way or another strongly with the state. He must not simply have passed through at one time or another. So this is the way that I got my large number of writers. Now, who were the major writers? I divided Indiana writing into 3 divisions, the early writing up to 1871, then the so-called Golden Age from 1871 to 1921, and the modern period since that time. Poetry was the dominant literary genre in the period of early literature. The strongest voices before 1871 are those of poets. The outstanding writers, many heretofore neglected in literary history, were as follows. I dare say that you have probably not heard of most of these. Nevertheless, they had something of a following, at least in their own day. Dr. Joseph S. Welch, George Washington Cutter, John S. Reed, Alice Carey, Phoebe Carey, you may have heard of them, Mary Louisa Chitwood, Sanford C. Cox, Sarah T. Bolton, Forsyth Wilson. Forsyth Wilson was something of a mystic. He had ESP. He claimed that you could put a letter on his forehead and he could tell you what was in it. The funny thing was that according to contemporary witnesses, he could. And he wrote a poem which Abraham Lincoln was supposed to have read at a cabinet meeting at one time. Now, the best poets of all were the Carey sisters, Alice and Phoebe Carey, and Mrs. Sarah T. Bolton. In this body of verse, one sees the strong mark of the frontier, the literary influence of Edgar Allan Poe, and a cultural lag in the retention here and there of the heroic couplet. Temperance, abolition, and the Civil War form the favorite subjects of the verse, and there is much reflection of sorrow, part of which is a pose. Now, the Golden Age was overshadowed by the novel, but it still produced much significant verse. The best poets were as follows: James Whitcomb Riley, Evelyn Steen, Max Ehrmann, and William Vaughn Moody. We claim William Vaughn Moody because he was born in Indiana, he taught school there, he stayed there for some time, and of course he taught at the University of Chicago for some time, so he remained in the Midwest. Now about James Whitcomb Riley. You either are very much for him or you're very much against him. Criticism about Riley tends to be extreme. Many people say that he is the greatest poet who ever lived, and of course that is absurd. Many say that he is subliterary, and I would say that also is absurd. Probably the best criticism of Riley lies somewhat in between. If you like sentimental poetry, if you believe that it is a part of literature, then Riley is one of the greatest of the sentimental poets. If you can't stomach this kind of thing, then he's simply subliterary. So it's pretty much an either-or situation, no matter how you try to look at it. Now, Evelyn Steen and Morris Thompson were Indiana's main nature poets. William Vaughn Moody is by far the best poet in every sense of the word. Now, the greatest poet of all 3 periods, that is, the early, the middle, and the modern, is, I think, William Vaughn Moody. However, for almost everyone who is a follower of Riley, he is Mr. Indiana when it comes to literature. Now, in the Golden Age, we had the flowering of the novel, which dominated all other forms of literature, even such things as Riley. This novel was predominantly romantic, and the typical novel was a wholesome, innocuous story written primarily for entertainment. Very few Hoosier novels were burdened with message. The genre divides itself into certain recognizable types with some overlapping. As a favorite comes a historical novel, the greatest period of its production being 1900 to 1910, with most of these books being highly romantic, such as The Circuit Rider, 1874 by Edward Eggleston. This is the great saga of the Methodist Church, and completely disregarded today by the Methodist Church. Wallace's Ben-Hur, 1880. Major's When Knighthood Was in Flower, 1898. Tarkington's Monsieur Beaucaire, 1900. And Edward Eggleston's The Hoosier Schoolmaster is, of course, more realistic than romantic. It's a combination of both. And it began the so-called Golden Age. Now, the romantic novel of the Golden Age was slight and entertaining, carried little of permanent value. It was concentrated from about 1900 to 1910 or 1915. The best are the Graustark series, Meredith Nicholson's House of a Thousand Candles, 1905. And by the way, that started a whole host of imitations. Almost immediately, a candy manufacturing company started advertising the House of a Thousand Candies. The only thoroughgoing realist was Edward Eggleston, sharing the honors of highest level of attainment with Tarkington, who dominates the realistic novel. Now, in contrast to the Golden Age, the novelists following that period were mainly non-professional writers, and the production of the later period, comparatively speaking, was a smaller quantity. Nevertheless, it goes strong. It continues strong. Drama is conspicuous by its absence. There was, in the 1920s, a little theater group in Indianapolis, which published a whole host of one-act plays. However, most of these were rather transitory. There were some dramatists, however, such as William Vaughn Moody, who, as you probably know, wrote The Mask of Judgment, The Firebringer, The Death of Eve, and finally then The Great Divide. George Ade, however, published a large number of dramas, but most of these were sparkling comedies, even musical comedies, such as the following: The Sultan of Sulu, The County Chairman, The College Widow. And The College Widow is still being played by high school groups here and there. Now, the most outstanding Indiana authors of all three periods were as follows in order of their birth: Sarah T. Bolton, Alice Cary, Lew Wallace, Edward Eggleston, George Cary Eggleston, his brother, and George Eggleston lived a large portion of his life in New York, so he's a marginal inclusion here. Morris Thompson, Mary Hartwell Catherwood, and I just found an article the other day about Mary Hartwell Catherwood. Who's your woman among earliest female writers, Indianapolis Star, about 1 year ago. James Whitcomb Riley, Carolyn Virginia Kraut, Charles Major, Eveline Steen, George Ade, George Warr McCutcheon, Meredith Nicholson, Ken Hubbard, Gene Stratton Porter, William Vaughn Moody, Booth Tarkington, Margaret Bruner, Newcastle, Indiana, just died a few months ago, Charles Scoggins, McCready Houston, and Marguerite Young. These are contemporary authors. Now, is Hoosier literature dead? Is it all in the past? Obviously no. Still going strong. Every year, Indiana University puts out a list of books published in the preceding year. This is a typical list. This one is 6 pages long. They've been as long as 10 and 12 pages long. Of course, this includes history and other writings, which I would not include in mine. That is, not necessarily belles lettres. Was there a Hoosier School of Literature? The Spiller, Literary History of the United States, says yes. I would say no. There was no real Hoosier school of writers, such as the local colorists or the naturalists, simply because the Indiana writers never cohered as a group, never held meetings, never adopted a uniform philosophy, a uniform attitude, a uniform production. No, there has not been any Hoosier School of Literature in that sense. There has been in this sense, in the sense that these many authors were bound together by geographical ties, often by the knowledge of each other and by personal friendship, yes. In the sense that these literary figures often wrote about their home state, yes. For 22 out of 35 novelists in the Golden Age, for example, each wrote at least one novel that deals with Indiana, and the total number of such novels being 64. In the sense that because of the presence of so many writers, Indiana, and particularly Indianapolis, has been a literary center of sorts since the beginning of this so-called Golden Age, yes. Yet Indiana has never deluded herself into posing as the literary hub of the universe. There's been no Holmes here who has made such a statement. Also, most of these writers were bound by a tie to romanticism and often to sentimentalism, and often they celebrated directly or indirectly the Hoosier scene and glorified Midwestern and Hoosier character. So Indiana literature has been a lively regional literature. Indiana literature then has tended toward the popular book, whether in poetry, the novel, or other forms. It has not been a great literature. There's been no Shakespeare, Milton, or Melville in the Hoosier literary fame. The contribution of Indiana writers has been surprisingly good nonetheless. If Hoosier literature has not always instructed its reader, still it has usually entertained him well and has excited both interest and envy. The principal contribution of Indiana to American literature, therefore, has been the strong current of romanticism during an age when the most important American writers have tended roughly, from the time of the Civil War to the present, to be more or less realistic. Lesser contributions are the truthful presentation of the Hoosier character and scene, as an addition to local color literature, and also pure entertainment. Finally, there have been many sincere writers, such as Edward Eggleston and Tarkington, who have had much to say in the way of serious observation and hard thinking.
Thank you, Professor Shoemaker. Our last speaker this afternoon will be Professor William Miller, Ball State University, also in the great state of Indiana. Professor Miller, I believe, did a dissertation at the University of Illinois under John Flanagan on Sherwood Anderson's short stories. He is published on Steinbeck and is executive editor of the Steinbeck Quarterly, headquartered at Ball State. Professor Miller will give us a few remarks about Gwendolyn Brooks' poetry. Professor Miller.
Part of my tactics call for you to shuffle through the pages of that little anthology I've prepared for you, so that won't bother me if you're clicking through the pages here at various times. I had intended to offer a slender contribution to the solving of our identity problem by comparing our enterprise with the more active and venerable enterprise of Southern literature. But with deference to others at this meeting, contentment with any opportunity to share ideas about Midwestern literature, however based, and respect for the ticking tyrant on my wrist, I want to devote all of my time to talking about the significance of Gwendolyn Brooks. Miss Brooks qualifies as a writer since she's had published at least 7 volumes of poetry and 1 novel, Maud and Martha, 1953. Although she has denied that she tries to evoke a sense of place in her work, her place is obviously Bronzeville, the black south side of Chicago, the city which is perhaps the literary locus of Midwestern literature. In 1968, she was named the Poet Laureate of Illinois. We may also say that she has remained a Midwestern writer, for though she was born in Kansas and at least last year was on the CCNY faculty, she has lived in Chicago almost all of her life and remained both physically and artistically within the Bronzeville milieu. Statements about the significance of Miss Brooks's poetry require supporting evidence as well as assertion. My particular interest in her poetry is aesthetic, though her work certainly should command the attention of those more broadly interested in Midwestern culture. I contend that she is one of the most significant living American makers of poems, and offer evidence both extrinsic and intrinsic. Not only the Pulitzer Prize she won in 1950 for Annie Allen, but also the more frequent inclusion of her poems in widely used anthologies and the praise of knowledgeable critics argue for her significance. In a note introducing her poetry, Theodore Hornberger stated that, quote, Annie Allen probably makes its point more subtly and with more force than does Wright's Native Son. And Hornberger also observed that, quote, technically Miss Brooks's poetry is impressive for range and variety of form, unquote. A. Poulin, I anglicize that, I don't know how he does it, included Brooks's poems in his fine anthology, Contemporary American Poetry, as one of the 22, quote, more significant American poets who have shaped the contours and direction of contemporary poetry since 1945. And in his review of Annie Allen in 1950, Stanley Kunitz, a fine critic and poet himself, spoke of Miss Brooks's excellent promise and especially of her capacity to be, quote, warmly and generously human, unquote. But we need to let the poems speak for themselves. What I would like to do is to suggest a tendency in Miss Brooks's poetic development and then call attention to specific poems in the 4 major volumes. In his 1950 review, Kunitz noted accurately, quote, how little energy that should go into the building of the work has been diverted to the defense of life in her poetry. The social protest is there, all right, unquote, before. Now, the social protest is there, all right, even in her first volume. However, there is some movement away from pure lyricism and toward social protest in the later work, especially in the Mecca. Miss Brooks's final volume, first volume, I should say, A Street in Bronzeville, and you have 2 selections there, includes a number of good poems and good parts of poems. The Bronzeville Street section of this book of poetry is, in some respects, Miss Brooks's Spoon River anthology, filled with vignettes. A glance at the list of titles is suggestive. The Old Marrieds, The Mother, When Mrs. Martin's Booker T, The Soft Man, Hunchback Girl, She Thinks of Heaven, The Ballad of Chocolate Mabby, The Preacher, Ruminates Behind the Sermon, Sadie and Maud, etc. In addition to this title section, there are longer sketches and the sonnet sequence beginning with, quote, or the title, quoted, Gay Chaps at the Bar, unquote, the Soldier Sonnets. From this earliest volume, I chose the 2 poems, The Mother and Gay Chaps at the Bar. About the first vignette, we might note not only the poignance and perhaps contemporaneity of the subject, but also the passion controlled by attention to form, how the syntactical patterns of the couplets in the 3rd section organically suggest the desperate ratiocination of the mother, or how fresh and fortuitous are the images in the 1st section and the word combination of luscious, snack, and gobbling. Miss Brooks said that the off-rhymes in the sonnet were a conscious choice, quote, because of the off-rhyme situation, unquote. Some of her best poems benefit from the coercion of such restrictive forms as the sonnet. The contrast in this poem between effective role-playing and the inability to cope with a confrontation with death suggest other of her poems in which black dreams and lifestyle encounter the inexorable establishment world. Again in this poem, one finds Miss Brooks's elliptical style and effective images and diction. Poems like the next 2 in your brief anthology help to confirm the promise of Miss Brooks's poetry in her 2nd volume, Annie Allen, 1949. I will save my comments about the birth in a narrow room for the conclusion of these remarks. For now, a paragraph by Kunitz may offer grounds for others' appreciation of the Pygmies poem. If you'd like to look at that for a moment. This is what Kunitz said. I should vote for this brief poem because of the exquisite rightness of its scale, because, knowing its own limits, it is cleanly and truly separated from the jungle of conception and sensibility that constitutes the not poem, because the imagery is sharp, the rhythm supple, the word choice and wordplay agreeably inventive, because the small and sequent pleasures of the verse are continually linked and at the last resolved, made one, and magnified. The concluding line is obviously triumphant in its massive concentration. Among the other details that please me are the effective manipulation of the off-rhyme, the wallowing and bleeding of the giants, the teasing ambiguity of come clean, the magical connotations of giant shine, the explosive irony in the context of the adverb punily. Also in the Annie Allam volume are such longer poems as I Love Those Little Booths at Benvenuti's and Men of Careful Turns, which illustrate Hornberger's comment about the subtlety and force of Miss Brooks's social criticism. In the latter poem, the speaker asks men of careful turns to admit me to our mutual estate. The tone is calm and dignified. Bankrupt liberalism is put down in the lines, how cruelty flaunts diplomas, is elite, delicate, has polish, knows how to be discreet. And the poem concludes eloquently in the plea that blacks and whites should put away prejudice, should combine and share the common lostness and quest for direction. Quote, we are lost, must wizard a track through our own screaming weed, unquote. In the third volume, The Bean Eaters, 1960, there appeared not only the effective parable, The Explorer, which has appeared in at least one widely used school anthology, but also the succinct social statement, We Real Cool. Miss Brooks once read this poem aloud and offered an interpretation. They have no pretensions to any glamour, she said. They are supposedly dropouts, or at least they're in the pool hall when they should possibly be in school. Since they're probably young enough, or at least those I saw were when I looked in a pool room, and they, first of all, let me tell you how that's supposed to be said, because there's a reason why I set it out as I did. These are people who are essentially saying, Kilroy is here, we are, but they're a little uncertain of the strength of their identity. I might risk a reading of that. A la Brooks, with just the one emphasis she suggests, and I'll mention in a moment. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. Perhaps too much emphasis, but this is what she said about that we. The we, you're supposed to stop after the we and think about their validity. And of course, there's no way for you to tell whether it should be said softly or not, I suppose. But I say it rather softly because I want to represent their basic uncertainty, which they don't bother to question every day, of course. The title poem of In the Mecca, 1968, is a long, free-verse journey through the Mecca building, a four-story Chicago apartment building. Miss Brooks returns in this poem to the vignette mode of her first volume. Indeed, she's recently said that she plans to continue mining this vein of ghetto life. The one poem from this volume offered here is not in any sequence, but represents Miss Brooks's sympathies with the black movement. And I invite you to just read that on your own. It's parenthetically, in an interview, she's spoken of her turning toward this more of a, what shall I say, a black militancy aesthetic, and she shares with many blacks the admiration for Leroy Jones as a hero for many of the black poets. And I've learned something this morning, too, further about what she has done in schooling the black poets. To conclude, I would like to return to the poem, The Birth in a Narrow Room. It is characteristic and it is admirable. Weeps out of western country something new, blurred and stupendous, wanted and unplanned, winks, twines and weakly winks upon the milk glass fruit bowl, iron pot, the bashful china child tipping forever yellow apron and spilling pretty cherries. Now weeks and years will go before she thinks, how pinchy is my room? How can I breathe? I'm not anything, and I have got not anything or anything to do. but prances nevertheless, with gods and fairies blithely about the pump, and then beneath the elms and grapevines, then in darling endeavor by privy foyer, where the screenings stand, and where the bugs buzz by in private cars across old peach cans and old jelly jars. To conclude, then, I would like to return to this poem and say that its theme may remind us of William Carlos Williams' Spring and All, in its dramatization of life taking form. But here a specific girl's individualism is revealed in blurred impressions, speech, vivacious acts, and revealing imagery. The versification and the pattern of imagery are especially noteworthy. We may observe that the lines are elliptical and disjunctive in the first stanza, but that the final two lines form a regular iambic pentameter couplet. Individuating form for the girl is paralleled by the individuating of the verse line. Similarly, the pattern of fruit images and containers in the closing line contrasts with the images in the fourth, fifth, and sixth lines. The contrast underscores how the harsh realities of the older girl's world conflicts with the idealized environment of the infant. But while Miss Brooks never winks at the realities here or elsewhere in her poetry, her characteristic temperament in her poem seems to be epitomized by the words in line 11. Gwendolyn Brooks prances nevertheless.